Thank you for joining us today for our Grief Sensitivity Virtual Learning Institute. This is the first part of a two-part series. The focus of this institute is on supporting those individuals experiencing grief and loss during COVID-19 and beyond. We're so glad that you could be here today with us. So today our session is a two-part series. My name is PJ Wanger. I am the School Mental Health Lead for Region 2, Northeast and Caribbean MHTTC. I'm so pleased to be your host for this conference session. Pleased to introduce this session entitled Grieving in the COVID Era and Beyond. I want to thank our wonderful speakers for being here with us today, and a big thanks to all of you for joining us. We truly hope you find today's presentation engaging and helpful in your work. So our session today is Grieving in the COVID Era and Beyond with Michael Ebb and Dr. Candy Can. Just some housekeeping items to start off. We've made every attempt to make today's presentation secure. If we need to end the presentation unexpectedly, we will follow up using your registration information. You will be muted and cannot share your video during this presentation. If you have a question for the presenters, please use the Q&A pod. You're welcome to use the chat box to link to other attendees or make comments. The session is being recorded and the slide deck will be posted on our website. If you attend at least half of the session, you will receive an email following the presentation on how to access a certificate of attendance. The event is captioned. To view captions, click the arrow beside the CC box at the bottom of your screen and choose Show Subtitles. If you need to change the size of those subtitles, you can click the arrow next to the CC box and choose Subtitle Settings, where you will find the option of making the subtitles smaller or larger. And if you don't already, please follow us on social media and stay in touch with us for further trainings. We want you to be sensitive to your own grief and recognize that, you may need to take breaks and stretch and drink lots of water, and that's perfectly fine. We want you to practice mindfulness or whatever helps you in staying centered and grounded. If you need help, these are the links to the helplines and the hotlines. They're also listed in the Learning Institute website. Additional information on grief. Again, we have some fact sheets that we've developed. These are also available on our website, so please feel free to hook into that so that you can get that information. The MHTTC network focuses on technology transfer, which means the adoption and implementation of evidence-based practices for mental health across the United States and territories. We develop and disseminate resources and provide free, local, and regional training and technical assistance for the mental health workforce. Here is our lovely map displaying the centers that make up the MHTTC network. We have 10 regional centers, a National American Indian and Alaskan Native Center, a National Hispanic and Latino Center, and a network coordinating office. You can identify which of your centers is in your area, and please visit our website and find your centers so that you can stay up to date on trainings and resources offered in your region. This presentation was prepared for the MHTTC network under a cooperative agreement from the Substance Abuse and Mental Health Services Administration, also known as SAMHSA. The opinions expressed in the presentation are the views of our speakers and do not reflect the official position of the Department of Health and Human Services, or SAMHSA. So let's get started. Now I want to introduce our speakers. So our first speaker is Candy Can, and she received her PhD from Harvard University and currently serves as an associate professor and faculty of residence at Baylor University. Her research focuses on death and dying and the impact of remembering and forgetting in shaping how lives are recalled, remembered, and celebrated. Currently, she is researching diversity in death, examining the whitening of the funeral industry and death studies, and arguing that the field of death and grief has been heavily influenced by white and Protestant worldviews. When she is not examining issues surrounded by death, she focuses on living well and is an avid reader, sometimes surfer. Michael Ebb, who also is on our webinar today, is the founder of Death Over Dinner, a partner at global well-being organization Round Glass, and the founder of Convivium, a creative agency that specializes in the ability to shift culture through the use of thoughtful food and discourse-based gatherings. Convivium has worked closely with thought cultural leaders and many foundations and institutions, including the Work Economic Forum, Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation, Clinton Global Initiative, X Prize Foundation, Feed Foundation, TED Med, Apple, United Nations Foundation, and the Nature Conservancy. Michael's writings have appeared in GQ, Food and Wine, Food Arts, Arcade, Seattle Magazine, and City Arts. Thank you both for being with us, and I'm going to pass it off to you.
Hey, PJ.
So we're gonna switch who's sharing. And Candy, you can share your screen now.
Okay, great. Thank you. It says I can't share while another participant is sharing. So we're still on screen share. Okay, there we go. Hi, everybody.
There we go.
Yes, I'm Candy Can, and Michael, do you want to say hi?
Yeah, thanks for joining us. I think we're gonna have a pretty extraordinary short period of time together.
We're so glad you're here today, and so I'm going to share my screen here. We're very excited to have you all here. We'll be going over a few slides, and then we'd really like to hear from you and generate a discussion so that we can kind of think about these things together. First, I want to go over what we'll be talking about. This is a two-part series, and we're so honored that you guys have decided to join us. We have lots of amazing speakers in this virtual conference, and it's a pleasure to have you join us here. We want to talk about how the pandemic has highlighted the ways in which marginalized communities are experiencing death and loss at much higher rates than white communities. And in this part, we want to also discuss how to talk about grief, death, and loss during the COVID era. So first, we're going to briefly introduce ourselves. I'm going to turn it over to Michael here, and then I'll come back.
Great. So my name is Michael Head, and as PJ mentioned, I'm the founder of a project called Death Over Dinner. And for those of you who are unfamiliar with Death Over Dinner, it launched 7 years ago as a platform to give people the tools to have a conversation about end-of-life planning, grief, loss, and really just mortality in general. And we launched almost exactly 7 years ago on August 24th, honoring the day that Elizabeth Kubler-Ross died, and partnered with the National Hospice and Palliative Care Organization and the Elizabeth Kubler-Ross Foundation. And there were 500 dinners held in a single night on the first night around the globe. And the death dinners, if you haven't, well, two things. One, since we launched, there have been over 1 million people who have taken part in these experiences. And for those of you who haven't attended or hosted a death dinner, the website gives somebody who's come to the site a very simple set of instructions, a couple questions to answer, and then generates a script for the evening. So there's no guesswork involved, and there can be a very safe container for a family, for friends, for strangers, coworkers, to spend a couple hours together, really examining, for many people, the first time, their end-of-life plans, maybe even some grief that they haven't been able to tap into, or an opportunity to revisit it, and then gives people very clear next steps about how to get prepared. And the second part of my work through joining Round Glass was actually to launch a much larger platform called EOL, and that's EOL.community. And what we learned from Death Over Dinner was very good to get people talking. We need to increase death literacy and make it so people aren't talking about loss or terminal illness or end-of-life plan exclusively with an oncologist or a therapist, or an insurance agent or a lawyer, but they have an opportunity to access these conversations within their family structure and to have nuanced conversations about how to honor each other, how to support each other in grief. But there was no good place to send people to create an end-of-life plan. We'll talk more about the importance of an end-of-life plan. But we created a pretty massive platform that launched a month ago called EOL, and there are over 400 providers, ability to create a plan, and now it's a community focused on grief and end-of-life preparation. But thrilled to be here with you.
All right. And I'm Candy Can. I have written 3 books about death and grief and just the way grief has operated in contemporary society. My first book was Virtual Afterlives, and that was about the intersection of grief and technology and the way that people have moved grief online and how online spaces have democratized mourning in the contemporary world, and also how many of the contemporary practices of grieving online are actually reflections of practices that have been around for a long time. My second book is Dying to Eat, which actually is kind of the academic version of Michael's book of Death Over Dinner. And in that book, we examined the way that food rituals intersect with mourning practices around the world. And I really loved that book because it was such an interesting examination of the way people use food and drink to kind of remember and incorporate the dead into their everyday lives. Every chapter began with a recipe, and I dedicated it to my mom, who really showed her love through food. And so I figured, I'm not an amazing chef. I love food, but I am not great in the kitchen. And so this was kind of my way of showing my love back. She died many years ago. And so I kind of saw this book as an homage to her recipe box of love, if you will. My third book was with Routledge, and it's Death and the Afterlife, looking at mourning customs from around the world, because I'm very interested in the ways in which people grieve around the world, and I feel like we have a lot to learn here in the West. So let me move us to our next one. This is kind of how Michael and I, our first big project together, we were working on, we were both on a panel, a steering committee for global wellness, and I'll let you tell this part of the story, Michael.
Great. And you can edit if I get some details wrong. For me, this work that we created together called the COVID paper began when lockdown started. And I was struck personally by the harrowing reality that so many of us started to realize was upon us, that people would be dying alone. And have always been people dying alone, and it's a terrible thing, and we should do everything we can to make sure that people have community around them. But with COVID, the reality that hit me like a semi-truck, that almost everyone would be dying alone for the foreseeable future, or at least separated from their family and loved ones, whether they had COVID or not, but because of COVID protocols, and that people would be grieving alone, and that funerals were not going to be a reality in the way that we need them. And I think there's a lot of work that we need to do to rehabilitate our existing rituals around end-of-life preparation and also mourning. But even the ones that we currently have were taken away from us, whether that was funerals or wakes or sitting Shiva, or so many different very, very meaningful rituals were now deeply jeopardized or just gone for foreseeable future. And so you add all of the ways that the world is on fire, you add this level of heartbreak and difficulty. And sitting with that, I was like, we need to do something. And I believe, and Candy can speak to this, but having the same realization, she has been thinking about this kind of reality for much longer and in a much more in-depth way than I have, clearly. But we started talking about what is it that we could do? How could we provide resources? How could we pool expertise? And on my side, it started with a Facebook post. And I said, in the end of life space, I want to gather some leaders with my friend Candy Can, and we want to think about how we're going to grieve in the COVID era, and what death and dying is going to look like in the COVID era. What are some strategies that we can create for lay people, but also for experts and funeral directors and medical directors? And within a couple hours, we had together gathered a group of about 80 end-of-life experts, and we started meeting once and sometimes twice a week for about 6 weeks. And it was one of those extraordinary moments in time that only COVID or something like it, I think, could have forced. People were available, they were motivated, and we, in my experience, is the first time medical directors and funeral directors and grief therapists were all working together. There's so many silos in this work, and we were all sitting in this space together, and we started by sharing about our work and what we thought would be effective resources. And then Candy can speak to some of the really beautiful essays and powerful essays that came out of that collaboration as well. But within about 3 months, or maybe even 2.5 months, we had co-written and published a pretty massive resource that's been used, I don't even know how many times at this point, and it's had an impact, and that has felt pretty extraordinary. The other thing that happened due to the COVID paper that we'll be feeling the effects of for a very long time were the connections and collaborations, and that new businesses, new initiatives, a deep understanding that just that one point that medical directors and funeral directors and grief therapists are all in this together, and they should know each other, they should see each other, they should collaborate together, and how powerful that was. So that's my genesis story of the COVID paper.
And we'll be talking about it more later, but I do encourage you to visit the link and peruse the resources. As Michael said, I think it's one of the more interesting collaboration stories, because we were also siloed before, just like, in MHTTC, you have school counselors and then hospital counselors and therapists and psychologists over here and psychiatrists over here. And so we have the same thing in the death world, and we have death doulas who never have contact with funeral directors, who never have contact with oncologists, professionals, who never have contact with, say, the Zen Center, et cetera, et cetera. So it was truly a phenomenal collaboration of all of these professionals in the death space. And it was interesting too, because a lot of us we're kind of competing for the same space. So it was this beautiful opportunity in which everyone truly wanted to make the world better. We were also excited to see the conversation surrounding death finally become more open, although we were absolutely sad and devastated at what it took to get that conversation to happen. So we also had this opportunity to have conversations as death scholars, death professionals, death industry workers, death tech people, in ways that we had never been able to have. And as Michael said, I love the stories that have emerged from this. One person had a really great, basically death ritual website in which she would help people grieve by creating rituals for funerals. But then her husband, he was a he was a content creator for a website company, and they let him go, so he lost his job. And then he decided to collaborate with his spouse, and they then created a new software app to help people and give them scripts to conduct memorials and funeral ceremonies. So there's some really interesting stories that have come out of the COVID paper. And also we're just excited because we're working, for example, with Evermore to change national policies on bereavement and to help generate a national or federal bereavement leave policy. Right now, bereavement leave is based on the company that you work for. And so it varies tremendously. And some people have access to bereavement leave while many people don't. A lot of it is class dependent, whether you're salaried or hourly. So there's an advocacy piece to the COVID paper too that has emerged that's been really exciting. This is kind of the background of where we came from. And I'll talk a little bit about this, and then Michael will jump in on some of these. But what we found is that there were some kind of pre-pandemic conceptions surrounding death and grief. And the first one is really that Kubler-Ross has been phenomenal in generating conversations surrounding death and in helping people to understand grief processes. But what we found is that the Kubler-Ross model is still the dominant cultural model in the United States, even though there has been a lot of advancement in grief theory and studies of grief. And so this model is no longer really applicable. Of course, it was originally written for dying, not even for grieving. So, but before the pandemic happened, Kubler-Ross was still pretty much culturally the dominant model, even though anyone who works in grief and death knows that there are a lot of newer advances in this area. The grief theory still focused on healthy grieving, with complex grief or prolonged grief, complicated grief seen as more problematic. And I think this is going to change, because with the pandemic, we're all going to be experiencing grief in the midst of trauma. We also have a lack of awareness regarding the many and varied cultural and religious variants of grief in grief theory. So it's been largely informed by Protestant experience, white experience. And I think that was pretty much a dominant model pre-pandemic times. There was little awareness of collective grief. I would say most people had never even heard of collective grief. And now you're seeing a little bit more in the news about that. This is a really big one. Employers were generally unaware or even uninterested in developing comprehensive grief policies. So I think this is going to change tremendously after the pandemic, because obviously if you don't have time to even make funeral arrangements, to care for those who have died, or even to take time to grieve after a death, then it makes it difficult on employers, because their employees can't be the most effective in the workplace. Also, we're finding that this generally falls on women. They tend to do the majority of emotional labor, and they tend to be the caregivers within the sandwich generation, right? So they're also not just taking care of the children during a pandemic, but they're also making the funeral arrangements, and they're being the healthcare proxies for their families while they're in the hospital. So we're seeing a lot of these kind of things. And grief was really seen mostly through a monolithic lens. So very much dominated by this white and highly Protestant experience. And that brings us to the next part that we really want to talk about, is that grief was also largely centered on non-traumatic grief experiences, and presenting the kind of non-white grief experience as a minority view. So even though a lot of communities of color, for example, might experience trauma in their everyday lives through things like racism, which happen on a regular basis, that grief wasn't looked through that lens. So these are some of the main pre-pandemic points of view. Michael, did you want to add anything to that?
No, I think we're good. Keep going.
Okay. So in this slide, you'll see the biggest and most important thing about COVID is not just the recognition of racism, the recognition that bodies of color are still oppressed and discriminated against, but there's also this recognition of racial disparity within COVID itself. And communities of color have been hit far harder by the pandemic than the white population. So here I have a chart here. It kind of demonstrates. So even though, for example, African Americans constitute only 14% of the population in the United States today, they're 1/4 of all COVID deaths. Okay, so we're really seeing a huge disparity that's affecting communities of color far more than white people. You can look at the hospitalizations here. Native Americans are hospitalized 5 times more than whites. African Americans are hospitalized 4.7 times. The Latinx population, 4.6 times. In death, of course, it's hitting the African American community the hardest, with twice the amount of deaths in the African American community as the white community. So we're talking about serious racial disparity that becomes evident through COVID death. So I think one of the things we really need to talk about here is not just grief, but what then does this mean, not just for communities of color, but for the American population in general, when a pandemic disproportionately affects one population over another. But along with that, we're seeing this shift in awareness and a change in the way that grief is understood and defined as a personal experience to now a collective grief. We really are seeing this kind of general acceptance of what collective grief might mean. We're also seeing a shift in increasing recognition for the need for better work-related bereavement policies. We're seeing workplaces understand that if they're actually serious about their commitment to diversity, that they're going to also need to be serious about their commitment to bereavement policies. Because if you have communities of color hit in disproportionate levels, then you also have them experiencing grief in disproportionate levels in comparison to their white counterparts. So this is a good thing, right? These are the things that are emerging out of the pandemic. And I'm going to turn it over to you here, Michael, with the death talk.
Yeah, and and I'll also tell a story. I was in Australia about 5 years ago, launching Death Over Dinner there, and there had been about 2 years worth of work from the Australian Centre for Health Research that before they invited Death Over Dinner to come to Australia. And the Australian Centre for Health Research is an institution that is unlike anything we have in the United States. All of the leading stakeholders from the medical community, the insurance community, the mental health community come together to improve the healthcare system in Australia. And that's their whole mission, is to improve healthcare. And they ran a 2-year study to find out how they could improve healthcare most dramatically. Would it be changing, admission practice? Would it be about bedside? Would it be about, electronic medical records? Would it be about following up, the way that they're delivering the care? And they discovered that with the overwhelming majority of the study came back that the place where most improvement was needed and could be most impactful was end of life. And then they did another, they were like, let's go deeper. Well, how could we improve end of life in a healthcare setting? And realized that, again, with an overwhelming majority, the place to improve was conversations about end of life, conversations that weren't happening. And it wasn't just advanced care directives. It wasn't just about making sure we have this form, making sure you have a health proxy, a pulse, et cetera. That what was really most important was conversations and advocacy. Because especially in a time like COVID, where people can't speak for themselves often, or innovated, et cetera, that it doesn't always matter what's on that form. But if you have a health proxy that is advocating for you and knows what you want, knows how to, help direct the care, that's the most powerful thing. And so they then did a big, a bit of research to find out who was doing end-of-life conversations. And then they said, hey, you, come on over to Australia. We've actually decided that you should exist. The conversations at end of life are a really good idea. And here's the research. And we hadn't done that research before we started Death Over Dinner. We just felt our way into it. And it was like, oh, great. If we ever wanted to get funding, now you've just proven the model. But nonetheless, and this story actually has two parts to it. And I'm gonna tell the second part because it does relate to how dominant the white narrative, white perspective is when it comes to palliative care, when it comes to end-of-life services, and grief as well. And so one stop on this 10-day launch was with about 100 Aboriginal leaders. And they were very nervous, and Aboriginal healthcare leaders, Aboriginal community leaders, and my hosts were very nervous about this event. This was going to be the hardest event. It's a very fraught relationship. A lot of healing's been done, but still don't know how it's going to go. And you could just tell their anxiety when we walked into this ballroom. And, and I was like, I don't know about the historical hurt other than what I've read, and I haven't been party to it. And so I'm just going to give my talk, tell people about Death Over Dinner, how I was inspired, how we were inspired to start it, the impact. And about 15 minutes into the talk, it was clear that I was making no impact. There was none of that great energy back from the room, the nods, the laughter, the murmurs, the smiles, the impact, nothing. Just hard eyes looking at me why are you even here kind of vibe. And I stopped and I stepped out from behind the lectern and I said, clearly something about Death Over Dinner, what I'm talking about, isn't resonating. And instead of just go on, I'd rather just ask you, if anyone can tell me, what about this project is not interesting or resonant or impactful, because I'd love to learn. And someone, said, well, we don't talk about death in the Aboriginal community. I said, okay, well, how do you talk about someone dying? He said, we talk about going home. I was like, okay, going home, got it. What else? And there was a little more energy in the room, right? Because people could actually feel that language. It made sense to them. We don't have dinner. That's a Gubba term. And I was like, I think I'm a Gubba. Okay, what does dinner mean? What do you call dinner? And I said, we have feeds. Okay, now there's energy in the room. People are excited, thinking about these events, what dinner looks like, what feeds look like, what happens there. Well, we tell, yarns at feeds. And then there was real energy in the room. And I said, well, why don't we scrap this name? We don't have to call it a Death Over Dinner. What if it's a yarn and a feed about going home, right? And massive excitement in the room, same absolute idea, changing the perspective, understanding the experience. And we got funding that day. We spent the rest, I was like, let's just spend the next 45 minutes, not me talking, but you telling me in these groups what should actually be at this new thing that we're creating together. And they got massive funding that day and they launched it. And it's just we don't even think about very often, how do we translate and how do we get the death talk to become more accessible to all kinds of communities. And it is still, COVID's this great earthquake that's hit the world. I don't say that with a smile, but we're in the middle of an earthquake, and it's it's actually reasonable to have an earthquake survival kit. And that, the metaphor there ends with having an end-of-life plan. It's just as reasonable now as people who live, along a fault line having a earthquake survival kit. So it's becoming more acceptable. There's a long story for a bullet point. Back to you, Candy.
I love it. So along with that, there's also a stigma, unfortunately, because COVID's been politicized. I know of someone who lost her father to COVID, but she has actually received some hate mail and awful stuff on social media saying that she made the diagnosis up. He didn't actually die of COVID, that she's bought into the kind of politicization, that she's a sheeple, and that she's just really a leftist because there is no thing as COVID. So there's some serious difficulty, I think, that's emerged in the pandemic that we saw a little bit of that in Newtown, Connecticut with the shooting in the elementary school, right? Where some of the parents were victims of a lot of hate mail afterwards. But we're seeing that again with COVID here in the US. So you have grief in the midst of trauma, which makes it a lot more difficult at times to garner support. But also, you just have so many more people experiencing death and grief simultaneously. So it's not like you can access the community in the same ways. I think people are really overstretched and just don't have the kind of resources that they had pre-pandemic to offer emotional support to others. We're also seeing body policing in conjunction with grief policing. And I would say that many people of color and even women have experienced body policing for years, right? With things like school dress codes. Just my daughter talks about how, how stupid it is that she's not allowed to wear spaghetti straps and shirts. And you also have people of color who have been unfairly policed, quite literally, by the police. So now the masses are experiencing this kind of body policing through temperature checks, through requirements on masks. So this makes it really difficult to work through one's grief, because you're experiencing not just grief policing, but also body policing. But then I'm going to end on this slide on a great note. Both Michael and I have been super stoked to see a real embracing of technology that might have taken years to become widespread. For example, this Zoom webinar, right? Like, I think before people traveled to conferences, and now we've had access to people, communities, organizations, and access to information and new communities through technology. So that's a real positive result of the pandemic and grief. So Michael and I kind of were
Can I add one thing, Candy?
Yeah.
Yeah, just one more note on that. The changes in death and grief during the pandemic, which has become really, I've become really aware of recently, which is thinking about my mentors and the people that shaped end-of-life care, and that we're currently this growth in end-of-life care and end-of-life doulas, and end-of-life consciousness. Those are individuals that were actually formed. Their model of care, their philosophy of care, was formed during the AIDS crisis. These are people like Ira Byock, and Katie Butler, and Frank Ostaseski, and there's a very, very long list. And the AIDS crisis was such a brutal and terrifying time in American history for so many people. It certainly it was also politicized in such a incredibly awful way. But nonetheless, there is a type of care, of compassionate care, and a merging of Western compassionate care and Eastern spirituality and compassionate care and Buddhist practice as just one note, and the rise of hospice and care homes, etc. So much of that came out of that crisis. And so right now, if we want some sort of hope hook to hang our hat on, for me, it is that the future of compassionate care is being formed right now in this crisis. And we don't even know how seismic the change will be 5 years or 10 years from now. But I can see it. We saw it in the COVID paper. We saw it in people's eyes, and we're transforming what that looks like. I hope that the change is, if we look 5 years, 10 years from now, if we can get to equity around who is treated how around end of life when it comes to BIPOC and queer communities, if we're able to obliterate that disparity, that would be the type of gift in the middle of this wound that I would hope. But be aware of it and think about it and notice it, that these type of extraordinary times do shape the future of care, the future of hospitals, the future of therapy, the future of all of these things. We're in a pretty extraordinary moment. So, Candy, here's one of those things that I think will pay forward.
Yeah, I agree with you. And I really, all of you who are attending this webinar, I feel like you guys are all on the front lines of this, and you're working with these people and helping them make sense of this. So we're really grateful for your work on the ground as we work through these extraordinary times. But I agree with Michael that these are not just extraordinary times, but they're foundational times. These are the times that are going to revolutionize the death industry, the way we talk about death, the way we think about death, and the way we care for others in the midst of grief. Capitalizing on that, we've really thought about, there's a lot of work on trauma and PTSD, and there's a lot of work on grief. There's not a whole lot of work on trauma-informed grief. And part of that is because, again, traumatic grief or complicated grief or compounded grief has always been seen as the exception rather than the norm. But this has been shifted and turned upside down in this time. So trauma-informed grief is how we want to talk about grief in the pandemic, because no matter who you are, this is truly a traumatic time in which to experience grief. And so we really want to talk about care and practices. And we'll be talking a little bit more about specific practices, specific rituals. We'll be giving you a lot of resources. We'll talk more about COVID paper. We'll talk more about EOL community and creating a death plan, end of life plan. But before we get into the pragmatic aspects that we want to cover in the second part, we want to just briefly back up and talk about how to approach trauma-informed grief. So grief in a pandemic is traumatic because there are multiple losses. People have lost jobs, and then they've lost a parent or a family member. People have not been able to be with their grandparent as they're dying in a care home. So no matter what that loss looks like, the loss of normalcy, the loss of privacy, there have been multiple losses compounding the grief that one's experiencing. And as anyone who's worked in grief care, one grief amplifies the other ones. So the pandemic's also spotlighted inequities, particularly those of race and gender. And we're experiencing policing of our bodies in new and invasive ways. Workplaces are requiring agreements or tests, or my sister has to sign a paper every single day saying that she's not come into contact with anyone that displayed signs of COVID. Some workplaces are requiring spontaneous COVID checks, temperature checks, masking. So, and this will probably only increase over the next year as we try to regain some sense of regularity and a return to everyday life. And then Michael, do you want to take over these last three?
Yeah, I mean, there's a grief fatigue with that, is written about some, and Candy can speak to it more, but I don't hear people giving individuals enough permission to be fatigued around the fact that it is just too much to process. And, the other thing is, I hope that grief becomes a household name. It seems like it is. But we also start to realize that grief is not accessible for everyone. There's, I know with myself personally, my father died when I was 13, and it wasn't until I was 20 in a completely unrelated incident where I finally was able to access his grief. And people would say, "Aren't you grieving?" And I was completely alienated by that question and the knowledge of how to grieve. And, we have it designed into our culture, the space or the time, for those of us who have a hard time accessing it. For a lot of people, it's just overwhelming. And they are very much in touch with it. But there is a large population of us that don't have as much access to it. But as far as the last items on here, for sure, the pressure to keep a job in an insecure world because of healthcare, the inability to reinvent oneself, to transform, the stuckness. There's a thing that there's nutrients in loss. There's nutrients for us to become something new. And death does have that kind of gift. It has a lot of suffering and pain that it gives us when we lose someone, but within it also is the nutrients to recreate ourselves. And if we are stuck and scared and fight or flight, or must stay at a job, or we don't have the ability to think creatively, we're not exercising as much, we're not taking care of ourselves as much, there is the inability, or less of the likelihood, to have that kind of transformative new self or new direction. And certainly people are experiencing grief simultaneously. We're all caretaking, in some ways, and who's taking care of the caretaker is very challenging to know, and how much one should be doing. And there's also the issue of moral distress. I've been speaking recently with a good friend of mine, Jack Saul, who's a great therapist, married to a much more household name, Esther Perel, another therapist. But Jack has been working with combat veterans, not on PTSD and trauma, which is certainly the headlines that we read around, combat veterans and mental health, but a more pervasive problem that, and according to Jack, and I haven't delved that much into it, but we wanted to at least include it here, is moral distress. And according to Jack, that moral distress actually has a larger impact on well-being for combat veterans than does PTSD, perhaps, which was like this tremendous light bulb that went off in my head. And so many of us are suffering from moral distress, whether we're on the front lines and we don't have a way to process the type of decisions that have to be made, or how medicine's being handled, or just the moral distress of living in the times that we're in. So how does that impact grief, in the same way that we need to talk more about how trauma informs grief?
So So we really want to encourage you all to not just work on grief care practices, but to think about how your grief care and grief counseling might be trauma-informed grief care, just kind of the same way that educators are being encouraged to think about trauma-informed education, right? Because this is a truly traumatic time. Let's see. I'm not advancing here. Hold on 1 second. I think it's like timed out.
There we go.
Okay, there we go. This brings us to the fun part of the webinar, and that is our discussion question or homework.
Yeah, so we have some time left, but I'm going to set this up and as a potentially as discussion question, definitely homework for part 2. And if you have general questions for us, you can also put those in the Q&A. And we'll do a little bit of a dance back and forth between some general Q&As and some discussion today about this question. But we would love you to consider it and maybe make a short list, and maybe it's a prompt for some writing before our next session. But let me set it up a little bit. The question is, and I think it's in our chat, how can facing our mortality act as a healing practice in our lives? And I'll tell a little story, as I like to do. After we started Death Over Dinner, it was very, very challenging to get the attention of the medical establishment. And there was no desire that I could find early on in our work to have a conversation about the D word. And many people said, you know, you really should change the name. And my response was, no, the name has the medicine in it. And that I really did want people to be able to have a confrontation, an engagement with their mortality, not in a euphemized word, not in the end of our lives, not last chapter, but death. And we found immense success with Death Over Dinner by people picking up these experiences, having them with their families, changing dynamics in families, organizations, hosting them, you know, strangers, coworkers, an incredible number of people. And it still was, the healthcare establishment was still eluding us. And then I was invited to come and speak kind of out of the blue at the Cleveland Clinic's Patient Experience Summit, which is their big annual summit a year, and gave this talk about Death Over Dinner and said, and I challenge you, like medical professionals, who wants to work with me to recreate Death Over Dinner as a toolkit, as an experience for healthcare workers? Because if you're not comfortable with this conversation, you're much less likely, we know statistically, to have the conversation with your patients, whether you're a therapist or whether you're a nurse or a cancer doc, etc. So I want everyone here to be able to increase their own comfort level and death literacy, to face some of their fears, to have a bit more of an experience around this conversation so that you're more available to your patients, and also your skill level will increase. You'll be more skillful in having these very difficult conversations. And it's almost an impossible ask to have somebody have the goal of care conversation which is really the how you're going to die and what you want to have happen when you're dying conversation. But we give it this incredible word goal of care. So nonetheless, I made that provocation to the attendees there, and Adrian Boise, the Chief Experience Officer at the Cleveland Clinic, got up on stage with me and said, actually, Michael, the Cleveland Clinic's going to partner with you if you'll work with us to rebuild Death Over Dinner from the ground up for healthcare professionals, which is not, we hadn't talked about it. It was a surprise to me. And then all of a sudden I was working with the Cleveland Clinic, and we did, and we built this thing from the ground up. And so but the story really starts with, after multiple dinners, I finally ended up having a dinner with the cardiothoracic department. And we'd gone up the kind of food chain, I would say, but we ended up having one dinner where someone said, this is a terrible idea. I'm going to come and tell the Board of Governors that we shouldn't be doing these death dinners. And then they'd fall in love with the evening and then host the next dinner with a group of doctors and nurses. And so we ended up at a dinner with the cardiothoracic department. And Cleveland Clinic is where they first successfully, were able to successfully complete a heart transplant. So pretty serious heart surgery department, very hard looks from this department as to who is this guy and why are we having a death dinner. And I told them in the beginning of dinner, I said, listen, without question, you practice medicine, and you're some of the best at it. And the medicine that you practice is the medicine that staves off death, that keeps us alive, that increases longevity. And there's no question, like, people understand that description and definition of medicine. And you do extraordinary work. I was like, tonight I want you to do something unreasonable with me. Tonight I want you to imagine that perhaps death itself is the medicine. And, the air goes out of the room. But they all got it. And there's something in us that just understands that facing our mortality is actually medicinal. Now, and they softened, and it was one of the most powerful dinners I've ever been a part of. And so some examples that I would give to answer this question to loosen up some of your thinking about it. One, if we're not talking about our mortality, we're either repressing it or suppressing it. These are the psychological states that are directly linked to disease. And there's study after study that shows repressive styles, suppression of emotion, directly linked to a higher risk of disease, right? So right there, if we're not talking about the thing that we all have in common, then we are repressing it or suppressing it. And you're activating a muscle that is the opposite of repression and suppression. This authenticity, vulnerability, open sharing, right? So we know that particular medicine comes from talking about death. It also is probably the best way to prioritize what it is you care about. We have a kind of other public health crisis that is a deficit of meaning. People are living lives where they don't know the meaning of their life. Talking about our mortality, facing it, has always been the most effective way to clarify why we're here, what we want to do with our time left, and who we want to be. And I watch it every time it clarifies, and people say, well, no, people don't want to talk about death. And it's like, no. People don't necessarily want to die. Got it. We're breathing, heart beating creatures. We have a bias to not even think about these things. We certainly don't. I understand fear of death. But people actually, in my experience, don't have a fear of talking about death as long as the framing is right. And I see it every time when I mention my work, so I'm going to lean back, and then they lean in and they'll start talking to me. So these conversations are conversations that people actually want to have. We'll talk more about how you frame them. I've got a lot of tricks and tools for how to create the right kind of container and the right kind of invitation to a variety of different people that you may think are completely unavailable for this conversation. But so these are some of the ways, and I could list another, 35 reasons why death is a kind of medicine. But we'll turn to some Q&A and see what happens.
So Michael, there's a few questions in the chat box. I think one of the first ones from a few people was about grief fatigue. Some people hadn't heard of it. They wanted to know more about it and how they could hold space for grief fatigue. Yeah.
So if it's okay with the people there, what I'd like to do is, because that was more of a bullet point than here's X, Y, and Z study and practice. But since there's some heat around this, what I'd like to do is spend some time and come back with some prepared thoughts. I could tell you, off the cuff some thoughts, but I actually think it requires a little bit more thoughtfulness. So we'll push that to part 2, if that's okay.
And I wanted to jump in on your, I am a single parent, and I have a 13-year-old, and I have to say I'm part of a single parents academics group, and one of the people was talking about how the pandemic terrifies them, and her ex-husband had died of COVID, and she didn't know what to do, and the top recommendation was figure out a COVID care plan and then write a will and figure out who will take care of your child. And she talked about how much that terrified her because, she didn't want to think about her child not having a mom as well. And it was interesting to see the responses of the other parents in the group because they said, actually, the anxiety was worked through by creating an end-of-life plan because they knew then that they had done everything they could to line up the best possible scenario for their child if she were left without either parent. And I have to say I agree. I mean, one of the first things I did when COVID happened was go see my lawyer and make sure my estate plan was in order. And I just, I think this is really important. And I know Michael and I both talk about this and probably tell you get sick of it. But having an end-of-life care plan is really, really, really important because it also shows everyone around you how much you love them. It shows that you cared enough to take away the anxiety and difficulties, the decision-making that might give them a lot more anxiety surrounding your death. So it's really important, and it's a huge gift to everyone you love to really give them an end-of-life plan. Right, let's turn to these other questions. Have you had a chance to look at them, Michael?
Yeah, quickly I'll take Lena's to the best I can. The difference between suppression and repression. So as far as I understand it, the difference would be whether something's in your unconscious or something's in your active consciousness. And so, repression is much more of a global state of the culture, creating an environment where we're not talking about these things. Suppressing something is you yourself or the people around you are asking you to, literally suppress or tamp down, that conversation. So suppression's a bit more localized, repression's a bit more global, but there's some more nuance into that. But that's a quick question. Quick answer. I think that this question here from Denise is a good one, though. Should we jump in there?
Yeah, so I was thinking when my mom died 22 years ago, she had a living will. She had sat down with all of us ahead of time. Everyone knew about it. And yet at that moment, my stepfather went to the doctor and said he wanted to keep her on life support. And so it's very interesting. My point being that even if you have these conversations, it is so difficult because it really requires the other person to accept the finality of what's going to happen. So Denise, I can only encourage just increasing the general conversation, but also maybe focusing on the gift aspect, that you really are giving your family a gift when you have these difficult conversations. And that if you can talk about impending death, you can also be more prepared, and the person dying can have control over what happens both to them and to their belongings. So having these conversations is actually a gift, not just to the family members and the friends, but to that person themselves, because the more prepared you are, the more that the anxiety surrounding those kind of conversations and decisions can be taken away. Michael, what do you have to add there?
Yeah, so the question, if people, let me just refresh it for people. What are your suggestions for family members that appear to be in denial about a family member's poor prognosis, being closer to death, and being able to recover? So a lot of thoughts there, but I'll try to be concise. You don't know why individual people seem to be in these kind of denials. We don't know about, and maybe you do, but with the people in question, but I've generally found is that's a fear-based response, and we don't know what's informing the fear. And so what I like to use is much more of an oblique method as opposed to a direct method. And because it could be just very, very scary terrain for somebody. And that's why I like to think about these conversations about end of life a little bit more like how we think about courtship or looking for a job. These are both, when it comes to courtship or looking for a job, we tend to be tenacious. We tend to take, some rejection in stride. We tend to be very empathetic. If the person that we're courting is allergic to roses, we don't bring roses, for instance. A lot of the end of life, and I'll get back to the courtship pitch to give it a little bit more color, but a lot of these conversations are very directional and sometimes transactional. I'm here and ready to talk. You're there and not ready to talk. There's something wrong with you not wanting to talk. Or I need something from you. My spouse won't have the conversation. My parents won't have the conversation. And you're trying to get them to do something that you've already done. And so that kind of directional, sometimes transactional dynamic can really freeze people. And, what I like to think about is how do I relate to this person about end of life? Are they a big Aretha Franklin fan? Well, let's talk about what happened to Aretha when they couldn't find her will, and there was one stuffed into a couch, but it wasn't signed. And the type of torment and pain that happened. Or do they like John McCain? Right, died at this pretty much the same time as Aretha, had everything in order, was able to, tell his family how to honor him, how to take care of him during the end. And so what you're doing is you're just starting to create, a relationship around this topic. And the other thing is, let's get the whole family prepared, right? You can, hey, so-and-so is certainly sick and has received a terrible prognosis, but what a great reminder, even if they might, have a quick and speedy recovery, what a great reminder how fragile life is and how we should all get some kind of preparation done. Make it a group activity, involve as many people as possible so that you take some of the pressure off the person who is having a fear-based response. So those are some of the areas. And then again, that's just that kind of courtship. Like, if I really want, someone to fall in love with me, you get creative, right? You become poetic. You think about different ways and people will say, my mom won't talk. And it's like, well, maybe a more interesting question is, what in you needs to shift so that your mom feels comfortable talking to you about end of life wishes? Now that's just a more interesting game. I mean, I'm, all about, getting mad at my mom, but if we really want to move forward, let's see, we have some new stuff.
I do think in these times, people need to have these kind of conversations.
Definitely. There's a great question here. How can we, and my dogs might, there's some dogs that are excited about something outside. So I'll mute myself. Go for it, Candy.
All right, sounds good. So we have another question that I thought was really good. It's from Evelyn Cruz. Inequities under this pandemic have been blamed on those experiencing the inequities. Is that also part of the moral distress? And absolutely. I think part of it is, I think there's a tradition of blaming the victim in order to not take moral responsibility. When we have inequitable systems of healthcare, when we have healthcare tied to jobs. So absolutely, yes. And I think I'm a little disappointed, to be honest with you, about the way that even COVID inequities have been reported. They tend to tie it to population density or poverty, and all of those they don't start with the idea that actually white supremacy has created inequitable systems of healthcare and care in general for others. And so this then creates a situation where communities of color are much harder hit. And so there's this aspect in which responsibility has been taken out of the equation. So I also think that's a huge part of the moral distress that we're talking about, and a huge part of the trauma that's being experienced. Let's see, there's a couple other.
Yeah, there's this really beautiful and difficult question to answer. How can we address conversations about death with additional challenges, like mental illness, substance use, or other strained relationships? This is where I think it's very important for our death literacy in general to increase across the whole continuum of care, so that it's more likely that the people that are hopefully taking care of people that in your lives that are suffering from substance addictions, mental health, mental illness, that those clinicians are more capable of, addressing the big D, or becoming grief trained. There's not, and Candy, you could speak to it specifically, but what are the grief programs and how many have people gone through? What's the level of credentials around grief, currently? And can we improve and increase that? I know that there are so many therapists that on, Psychology Today that say, I specialize in grief. Well, what does that actually mean? And so I'd love to hear your thoughts on that, but I'll give one other. And maybe, it's not that psychology's your space, but this notion of, there's been some work around dementia directives, for instance, and Alzheimer's directives, and making sure that people, when they have early onset Alzheimer's, are specifically, not that that's mental illness or substance use, but it is another wrinkle in thinking about end of life planning, and also grief and moral distress, because certainly it becomes very challenging to know how to properly take care of a person in the later stages of dementia. But one of the sad ironies there, and it's not ironies, but I guess tragedies. A good friend of mine is Dr. Barak Gaster, who created the Dementia Directive. And he said, well, at first we started asking people with early onset Alzheimer's to make sure that they had a dementia directive. And then we realized that the part of the brain that would actually be most utilized for creating a directive like this, to imagine themselves in a future state and make decisions, that's the part of the brain that is most impacted by early onset. And so he was like, it's not that it nullifies doing it, but it really complicates the dementia directive. And so, you know, since 30% of us will likely have dementia, I believe the numbers are, is like, I want to get everybody to do a dementia directive, you know, so that when you do have that full capacity of imagining yourself in a future state and thinking about what you might have. So, you know, I don't know what that means for bipolar or for schizophrenia or for, you know, borderline or any of the different illnesses, or what it means from an addictive, a substance abuse and addiction mentality. So I would love to see deep death education and grief education be shot through all of those fields, and to see what, I mean, Andrew Solomon would probably be a great resource. Andrew Solomon is one of the foremost thinkers on schizophrenia, bipolar, and depression, and he's now been doing a lot of work in the end of life space. So that would be my suggestion, is to seek out Andrew Solomon's work. We're pretty close to time, but do we have any last questions? Anything in chat that we missed?
We do want to encourage you. Your homework is to think about and answer this question that we put in the chat box here for you. To think about your mortality and how facing our mortality can act as a healing practice in our lives. I have to tell you here a funny little story. When my kiddo was 4, she asked her babysitter whether she wanted to be buried or cremated when she died. Needless to say, we have lots of death conversations in my home. And the babysitter was definitely freaked out because we've actually had these conversations frequently and often. And another story on that, she then drew a picture of 3 tombstones for her pre-K teacher. And one said mommy, one said daddy, and one said Maya. And so I had to explain to her pre-K teacher that no, we did not have trauma in our home, but that I was a death scholar. And that was actually a common conversation for us. But so I do want to encourage you, both of us want to encourage you to, between now and our next session, where we'll give you some very practical and pragmatic tools, to have a conversation with those around you, and to think about your mortality, and to think about what work you still have to do there, and what kinds of things you could maybe plan out. Michael, do you have anything else to add there?
Yeah, in closing, 2 things. One, when it comes to children, there's certainly the kids in our lives are, in all of our lives, are more exposed to death than ever before. And, you know, my rule has been with children is to follow their curiosity. And so if you do have a child that's curious and asking questions, the best thing to do there, I've found, is to meet their curiosity. And there's a great book, if you have younger children, called Death is Stupid, by Anastasia Higginbotham. And it's an amazing book for like up to maybe 7 or 8-year-olds. And then there's another book that I think is really extraordinary for maybe 6 to 10-year-olds, and that's called Life and I. And it is an extraordinary book that can explain it can beautifully frame this, what death is and this ever present. And then also, if you're talking to your children and they ask you a question that you don't know, it's okay to say, I actually don't have an answer to that. I'm in question about that myself. But we could do a whole talk on children and death. The one thing that I'll say in closing is that the work that Candy and I do, and so many of us do, is really focused on returning death to the community. I would say that death is a community act, not a medical act. And much like our food system, which was industrialized because of thinking that it would be more, it could scale, it could be more effective, proficient if we industrialize food and patented seeds, perhaps. As it turns out, when we do that, we do strip the nutrients out of the food we eat and the soil. And the food is just not as nourishing and leads to a state of more disease. And the thing is, we've done that with death too. And it's not because there's a big bad, seed patenting company, but it really is more just, this Cartesian thinking. We ended up here, and it seems logical to medicalize this as part of our life. And the reality is, until it becomes a community act again, we do also miss the nutrients of death. And unfortunately, COVID, has put us at a great distance and does strip much of that nutrients out of the experience, because it is proximity. This is why people sit Shiva. This is why there are open open cremations in India and Varanasi. This is open caskets. Like this proximity to the loss is really important and essential. And some of the rituals that we can't have now because of time, because of COVID, I invite people to, one, create an altar, and we'll talk more about this, in their house if they've lost somebody, and have a place to actually genuflect and think about that person in their house. The other thing is, you can have a funeral later. We can always take a healing and grieving ritual and put it into the future. And that doesn't strip it of its meaning. It actually might be more meaningful for people to have some time. So those are.
Michael, I'm sorry to interrupt, but we are coming up on time.
Yeah.
So I thank you, Michael and Candy, for all the information. We ask our participants to please take our survey. Again, it is how we get your feedback so we can provide more trainings, and how we get our funding through SAMHSA. So I want to thank everyone for joining us today. It's been our pleasure bringing this session to all of you. Today's presentation slides and recording will be available on our website. As a reminder, the next thing that is happening in our virtual series here is our breakout sessions. So there are 3 breakout sessions: grief sensitivity, school mental health, and the evidence-based practices. So we encourage you all to join one of those, and we wish you all a good day.